So welcome to another Classical Conversations. I'd just like to go over some books about Schubert. This is probably the best one I've read. It's Schubert's Beethoven Project by John M. Gingrich. It's a wonderful book, highly recommended. It's the best book I've read about him. I don't agree with everything. He says, for example, he speaks of the E-flat trio as being sort of written, a part of it being, I think, curtailed slightly in order to fit in with the requirements of a particular publisher or something like this. There's something like that, which I don't agree with. I think that it's not quite right about that, but everything else, I think he's got a good point. His basic point is that Schubert was very conscious of being in the shadow of, well, not in the shadow so much as can you go and get John and tell him to go downstairs? You're not allowed in the video, Johnny. Tell him to come outside and help you with the den, because you've got some more work to do. Yeah, you got what? You got language work. Yeah. Actually, yeah, I'll come and give you some in a bit. Okay, so he writes that Schubert was consciously aware that what he was doing was very much influenced by Beethoven, and he wanted to write in such a way that the public could distinguish between himself and Beethoven, basically. So, for example, in the piano sonatas, there were all three movements, but there were four movements, except for the great A major and DC 664. But he says that that's the exception that proves the rule. They're written after, I think, 1824 in four movements to distinguish, to contrast himself from Beethoven, who was writing three movements, except for the Hammerklavier, of course, and he did the last one was some two movements. There's, I think, two movement works by Beethoven, but basically it was three movement piano sonata man, whereas Schubert wanted to be four movements in a way to make I think his point is to make it more accessible, I think, to the amateur public, maybe. In any case, in other things, he tries to separate himself. So the octet is like the septet in all the movements, very similar, but it's very different as well. Especially in that movement where they've got the tremolando of the violins and Can you stop that, please? There are lots of other examples he uses, and he talks about about the symphony, the Ninth Symphony, and how he was consciously quoting from the Ninth of Beethoven, and all for a reason. And his concert that he gave was on the anniversary of the death of Beethoven, Schubert's one concert, and that was obviously to draw attention to the fact that he was kind of like the next Beethoven, and he always tried to write a thing a bit bigger, a bit longer. The works were a bit longer. The octet had one more player. His final sonatas were the same sort of length as Beethoven's longer sonatas, and so on and so forth. It's really interesting and well written. But it does go on a bit in terms of it gets a bit dense, musicologically speaking, regarding the octet and things like that. But there's a lot of this sort of music in it, so it's not really for the it's quite specialist, I would say, in a way. Although it's packaged in a what's the word, in a very kind of in a public friendly, amateur friendly way. It's actually quite specialist, really. And because a lot of it's taken from his from I think academic papers. Not a lot of it, some of it is taken from separate papers which he's included in this, if I'm not mistaken, which are, I think, quite specialist. But it's a brilliant read, a really good read on the whole. So I definitely recommend that. Just while I'm here, this is the Thayer book of Beethoven. I wouldn't really recommend this book too much because it's all very well, but it's a lot about the history of Beethoven's around Beethoven's time in Vienna and what was going on with Napoleon. And there's a fair amount which isn't included in this, which I mean, I found it not the most enjoyable book, but it's okay. It's got some good things. I haven't read the Thayer biography, but I'd like to read that very much. And that sort of draws. It doesn't have anything new to say. I think about the Thayer. This is about Beethoven that the Thayer doesn't say, except to say that Thayer relies too much, I think, on what's his name, on Beethoven's secretary. Can't remember his name. On the secretary of Beethoven's work, which was the first, I think, biography. So his name was. Anyway, can't remember right now. But yeah, he's the. I think it's something like Schindler, I think. He's the secretary who was quite faithful to Beethoven, but history says that he's distorted some of the accounts so as to look more favourably on himself and Beethoven. But in any case, it would be and so Thayer, I think, doesn't take that into account. Can you stop that, please? This is another Schubert book, and it's actually surprisingly good. I mean, it's not really for the general public, but it's got an interesting thing which I didn't know about the octet, which is that the octet's not my favourite work, I must say. I love that movement. I think it's the final movement with the tremolando in the in the violins. I really like that. But it mentions what it mentions, and it just links to a previous video I did, was Schuppanzig, the famous violin player who had a series of subscription concerts. He, in this book, here, this chap Gingrich says that he can't find much evidence that Schuppanzig thought highly of Schubert's work for violin, for the quartets, and for quartets, because the quintet was published posthumously and much later, I think 20 years later. But anyway, in Schuppanzig's lifetime, he didn't seem to play many of Schubert's quartets that much, or his octet that frequently. But and he says that he could only conclude that Schuppanzig didn't much like Schubert's work compared to Beethoven's work. But here, so this is published in 2014. That's quite late. This was published in 2003. So this surprising that the other book doesn't make mention of the fact that what was it? Yeah, that Schuppanzig, this violinist, he had a concert. I think it's him anyway. I think it was Chopin's. Yeah, had a concert when he gave the septet of Beethoven, followed by the octet of Schubert, and maybe that was Schubert's intention to have them played together. But in any case, the octet was written in 1824, so way before Beethoven died. And let me find the date of this concert. 1824. So it says that he gave a concert. Yeah, it's they didn't even mention he makes of the Tremolandi, which is such an amazing passage in the final movement of the octet. Is it just says the sense of mystery is maintained, not to say increased, in the slow introduction to the finale, with its tense tremolandi and its rapid lurches between loud and soft tone. I mean, that's it. There's very little about that very important opening of the final movement. I mean, for me, it's the climax of the whole work. It's the main. It's the what's the word? It's the fulcrum of the whole work, in my opinion. I mean, it's surprising it's only a tiny bit gets mentioned, a line or two. In any case, what is interesting is this thing about Chopin's, which I'm going to get to eventually. Um, oh no, okay, so here goes. Look, so yeah, it was okay, not Schimpanzee then. It was. I think it's not Schimpanzee. Let's see it. So when in 1824 he was commissioned by Count Ferdinand Troyer, chief steward at the court of Archduke Rudolph, Beethoven's distinguished musical friend and patron, to compose an octet for wind and strings as a companion piece for Beethoven's highly popular septet. Now, I think the septet is much better than the octet myself, apart from that last movement of the octet, which has an amazing opening. But in general, I think the septet's much better, my opinion. But anyway, as a companion piece for Beethoven's highly popular septet, his state of mind seemed bound to have a bearing on what he produced. He was not, after all, a man whose music contradicted his feelings at the time of writing it, or existed, as Mozart's or Beethoven's was capable of doing, on an entirely separate plane. But yeah, so my point is, it was in 1824 when Count Ferdinand Troyer, the chief steward at the court of Archduke Rudolph, who was, I think, Beethoven's best friend, if I'm not mistaken, according to that Thayer, this George Marek book. He was maybe Beethoven's best friend. And it'd be surprising if his chief steward at Archduke Rudolph's court, who commissioned a work for Schubert as a companion piece for Beethoven's septet to be played it says as a companion piece. So I assume that a concert of the septet would have taken place in 1824 or 1825, and this the chief steward of Archduke Rudolph apparently asked Schubert to write a companion piece, which turned out as the octet. So the concert for the octet would have surely happened in 1824 or 1825 as a companion to the Beethoven septet. It would have been in the one concert. So Beethoven must have known about it, and he may have even gone along. I don't know how good his hearing was. Apparently, it was deteriorating around 1801. But nevertheless, he would have certainly gone to that concert, I imagine. Certainly would have known about Schubert, is my point. And I find it astonishing to think that they wouldn't have met, Schubert and Beethoven, given that this octet was written as a companion piece for the septet in 1824, 3 years before Beethoven died. I mean, how many more performances did it have after that? And that's, of course, not to mention any of the other pieces of Schubert which Beethoven would have known through musical journals and things like this. Okay, so that's what I have to say about the connection again between Beethoven and Schubert.